Hi, I'm Mihiri Jansz. I'm from the Postgraduate Institute of English, the Open University of Sri Lanka, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of language competences in identity negotiation in Sri Lanka. Before I begin talking about my study, I thought I'd tell you a little bit about Sri Lanka itself. It's an island nation which is home to nearly 22 million people, many of whom are bilingual or multilingual. It's situated in the South Asian region, and there are three major languages that are spoken, that is Sinhala, Tamil and English, and in addition there are minority languages in use by very small pockets of communities such as Vadda Creole, Sri Lanka Malay and Portuguese Creole. Sri Lanka identifies as multilingual, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, with Sinhala Buddhists forming the majority of around 70%. So to continue with a little bit about the background of this particular paper, English is used actually by a very small percentage of the population of the country. According to the census data from 2012, um, of the 16.9 million population who are 10 years or older, only 23.8% of the population were able to speak English. And so I was very interested actually in how first language speakers of English kind of negotiated their identity, and from these findings, from these major findings, this paper focused on one of my main findings, which was the role that national languages enacted in the identity work of these first language speakers of English. A little bit about the literature review before I move on to the methodology. One of the principal theoretical frames through which I have looked at the data and made sense of the data is using Bourdieu's forms of capital theory, and particularly focusing on linguistic capital and social capital. And as we know, linguistic capital comes into play when you have kind of an unequal access to a legitimate language, right? A legitimate competence, and this creates a kind of a specialized sort of value for certain types of codes. And social capital, of course, has something more to do with the kind of access you have to different groups and solidarity memberships, and from how you accrue benefits from these very memberships and solidarity associations. Some empirical studies that have looked at identity and language, which are relevant to the findings of this particular aspect of my study. Um, want to discuss Arias' study with an individual from the San Andreas Islands. He looked at how this individual was able to use his different, the extent of his linguistic repertoire for different situations, and how he sort of manipulated and negotiated language used to suit his identity needs. And one of the things that was very interesting that came out of his study is that even though there's so much sort of pressure in terms of ideology and policies that exerts pressures on individuals, they are still able to be agentative while being influenced by such a macro context. They are still able to be agentative. Bailey was studying the identity negotiations of uh, a group of Dominican American students, and he focused on this one particular student who actually struggled to assert his identity as Dominican American Hispanic. He used to index his identity by using Spanish, but unfortunately, sort of the phenotype, racial categorization or indexing continued to happen to him, and he was sort of categorized as African American. And this kind of tells you about the pressures that sometimes you are not in a position to fight back, like how much you sort of identify there is a very strong other ascription. And finally, another study, this is like an autoethnographic study of Language and Identity by Seeb. And his experience was quite interesting because he identifies his heritage language as isiZulu, and the context is post-apartheid Africa. And what happens is that when he's schooling, his parents decide to kind of really switch to English. But what resulted was that Seed was competent, an expert speaker of English, but became inept in his sort of heritage language, what he culturally identified with, which left him feeling alien and culturally lesser and not belonging. So the kind of impact family language policy can have on the identity and the identity negotiation of a person is quite far-reaching. So within this kind of understanding of how languages and identity can interact in different contexts, as I said, my study was of those who spoke English as a first language. All of these participants were, 8 participants were bi or multilingual. And I used thematic analysis to analyze the in-depth interview data. And the data was analyzed also using the theoretical framing I used was positional theory by Davis and Hare 1990, and Pavlenko and Blacklist 2004 framework of identities. So a little bit about the participants in this study. As I said, there were 8. And as you can see, diverse ages. I tried to get kind of a maximum variation sample as much as possible. And so I had like a bit of a spread in terms of age, and also in terms of ethnicity. In terms of linguistic repertoire, unfortunately, I only had 2 participants who could claim Tamil as part of their linguistic repertoire, and only one who had Tamil as his other first language. And also, I'd like to explain a little bit about ethnicity. In Sri Lanka is actually quite ethnic in that sense that our ethnicities are quite very important to our sense of self. And within this context, you have different types of ethnicities, but my participants have fallen into the Burger category, Sinhala category, Tamil category, Malay, and the Malay category. And you can also see there's also mix. So when you have mix, I am saying mixed parentage, where one parent would be Burger maybe, and the other parent would be Sinhala. So this is where I have given this also the notion of mix. And I also should highlight that the first who burghers are, because you might not be so familiar. Burghers are descendants of former colonists from Portugal and from the Netherlands. So their descendants are identified as burghers. They are usually who have intermarried with the local population but still retain sort of a more Western culture. And burghers actually claim English as their mother tongue, whereas Sinhala ethnicity, those in the Sinhala ethnicity are expected to speak Sinhalese. Tamils are expected to speak Tamil. And then Malays speak Malay, but also keeping in mind that we have Moors who are also Muslim. Malays and Moors are both Muslim, and usually Moors would be speaking Tamil, and this becomes relevant when I discuss some of the findings from the data. So I'm going to begin by talking a little bit about my participants and what came up from the data. Now, Azani, who is Malay, and Lakshman, who is Tamil, took great pride in their competence in Sinhala. And for me, this is really interesting because this is not a question I even asked them. It was like a kind of a by the way thing that came up in the interviews where I noticed they put a lot of value on their ability to speak Sinhala, to use Sinhala appropriately, and this was a source of pride for them. And this is interesting because they're both from minorities in the country. Azani, interestingly, was actually quite uncomfortable with being positioned as a Tamil speaker. Being a Muslim, she was sort of other ascribed and sort of expected to be able to speak Tamil. But she was very uncomfortable with this positioning. And with Azani, I felt that she had sort of a negotiable identity because she was sort of pushing back against ascription as a Muslim who should be speaking Tamil, and also pushing against sort of an English speaker too in some ways, because she wanted to give more prominence to her Sri Lankanness rather than being sort of an alien English speaker, which is also something that she saw, I think, in the positioning of English speakers in the country. Iris, on the other hand, took great pride in her English speaker self. But as I said, she's a burger, and burgers are sort of expected to have English as their mother tongue, their first language. And with Iris, I found a very interesting kind of situation where she is a competent user of Sinhala, but she distanced herself from that competence. She wanted to very clearly ascribe it as a second language. And there I kind of see that she was really needing to assert her assumed identity of a first language speaker of English, a mother tongue user of English, and that English was her language. She had great ownership over it, and I think she didn't even want to dilute it by claiming this competence in Sinhala. Two of the most interesting participants who had the most interesting experience for me was the struggles that Rekha and Desmond had because they were less competent in Sinhala. And that kind of showed like how being competent in Sinhala and less competent in Sinhala can really affect your your negotiation and your cultural and linguistic capital. And so Desmond tells me something like this. What I consider, if I had a better knowledge of Sinhala across the whole country, my travel or my interactions, my involvements with anything would have been very much better. I think the Lanka of Sinhala therefore deprived me of communication. That's a very bold statement where he's saying not being competent in Sinhala. And remember, he's also a Sinhala national. His ethnicity is Sinhalese. So he is really struggling with that idea, and I think he would have probably felt sort of pressure like, why don't you speak in Sinhala well? And he felt kind of a gap with most people, and so it really deprived him of a kind of a social capital. And Rekha puts it in context as well. Now, Rekha is a Burger Sinhala mix. That means her dad's Burger and her mom's Sinhalese. But the family is very English speaking, and as a little kid, she had resisted Sinhala. So her Sinhala is not very good, even though she studied in Sinhala, at least some of the subjects. She's not confident to use it spontaneously in a day-to-day situation. And the reality is that most day-to-day situations other than in the north and east is in Sinhala. Like if you go to a shop, if you go in the bus, if in most instances, the language on the ground is Sinhala. And here's what she experienced. So she goes to this shop. Her mother has sent her, I think, to get something. And this is what happened. She says, I didn't know how to say that. And I'm pretty sure she didn't understand. She's talking about the shopkeeper. I said it in a jumbled, very, very wrong sentence. It was horrible, Sinhala. And the people next to me were looking at me. And I was like utterly flustered. And she goes on to talk about, like, she was really annoyed with her mother for putting her in this situation where she was so awkward. Rekha comes out with a couple of situations like this, like when she's attending a private tuition class, where the teacher speaks in Sinhala, the students speak in Sinhala, and she's so completely out of place and not able to really participate, and she actually leaves the class. So this lack of the national language, the language of solidarity, the language of the ground, on the ground, really sort of constrained her identity negotiations and constrained her ability to sort of fit into different contexts. Moving on to my last three participants, Kanti, being like an older bilingual, was actually pretty comfortable in her skin, and she didn't have any real issues. And I think that was because she was a balanced bilingual as well, and probably also age had given her sort of the confidence to navigate different situations as well. Callum I found very interesting because he is a very balanced bilingual, but he kind of sort of resents English. He doesn't really like English. He wants to be like really emotionally distant from English while using it to his advantage. He wants to see English merely as a utilitarian tool, and he's much more sort of his affective is with Sinhala, right? That's where his heart is. So he had like a very interesting orientation in terms of his competences and his language identity. And then finally, Gerald for me was, I think, the most interesting participant because here language didn't seem to be the main direction in which um, sort of defined him. And I'm reminded of Arias, where he pointed out that even though there are all these overt forces sort of dictating identity, there is room for agency. And I think Gerald showed that. And even though Gerald, being a Tamil, was not a Tamil speaker, and he like had a lot of negative other positioning by Tamil speakers, but that didn't make him change who he was, and he was pretty comfortable being a Sinhala speaker, English speaker. Like those are his two major languages, and Gerald kind of like sort of, I think, establishes or negotiates his identity more through his profession. He's a retired naval officer, and I think that really sort of defined who he was. And his linguistic identity didn't really make such a big difference to him, unlike some of the other participants in my study. So, what I conclude with this discussion is how important, like, the social capital Sinhala brings to the table for Sri Lankans, particularly those. My participants were all from the center. They're from Western Province and the Central Province, so not from the north or the east. And it gives them voice. It facilitates social interactions in different types of contexts. And I think I also saw through my study that Sinhala sort of was a strong reflection of how much it is a marker of Sri Lankanness. And so, because my participants also saw themselves very strongly as Sri Lankan, most of them, I think, also relied on Sinhala to help them mark or index that part of their identity. And I think if they were not competent in Sinhala, it's sort of like they're kind of lesser Sri Lankans, and that's where like the discomfort lay. A little bit like Seeb and his sort of discomfort because he was not a competent speaker of isiZulu, and so his cultural marker was like he felt lesser. Um, and I also feel, this is what I interpreted, is that the more competent a bilingual or multilingual a person is, the more that person will be able to move or fit in different contexts. So for my participants, but I think I can extrapolate this to most people in Sri Lanka. And not to say that Sinhala competence is the sole factor here. I think depending on where you are, it might be Tamil, depending where you are in the country. And also the fact that English is still so powerful and is definitely has a linguistic capital is something that we can't ignore. That said, I feel that there should be more awareness and about the importance and value of national languages for identity work, and that we need to promote more bilingualism, multilingualism in Sri Lanka in the face of this sort of concerted English spread. And because we're spending such a lot of time and effort on English, but this can lead to language loss, I think, possibly over time, and this needs to be prevented. With that, I'm going to end my presentation. These are my references. Thank you so much for your attention. Love to hear from you. Thank you.